Hello, Rocky Mountain Total Rewards Association Summit attendees. My name is Jeff Harry with Rediscover Your Play. And today we are going to be talking about Dudes Do Better, Dismantling Toxic Masculinity at Work. So let me go ahead and pull up my agenda for today. I'm very excited for y'all to be here. Let me grab this. And then let's actually get started. Okay, so dudes do better, dismantling toxic masculinity at work. So I want you to start off by visualizing that toxic person that you have at your office or at your workplace. And if you don't have that, then congratulations for not having that. But then go ahead and visualize someone that was toxic in the past. And as you're visualizing this toxic person at your work, I want you to think of what feelings come up for you. Like, is it anger? Is it frustration? What comes up with you? How do you feel? And what is actually happening in your body as you visualize this toxic person? As we're going to explore what actually happens to us when we have a toxic person in our workplace. What are the feelings that come up? Are you frustrated? Are you livid? Like, what's actually happening? Okay. And then when you've gotten that good picture, go ahead and shake that off. Shake that off. Get that off of you because you don't want to think about that person right now, not just for a moment, because now I want you to visualize that coworker you admire. Who is that person that you actually look forward to seeing at the office? Someone that you confide in, that you trust, that makes it so much better for you to be there. What are the feelings that come up when you think of that person? How do you feel just visualizing the fact that they're going to be at the office as opposed to someone else? And I want you to sit in those feelings for a second and then just notice the difference. Notice the difference between those two because we're going to explore the psychology behind that and how that's actually affecting your work. Okay. All right. So, what are we going to be covering today? So, we're going to be exploring how toxic masculine leadership has affected our past. And how's that impacted the way in which we work? Then we're going to explore how much is toxic masculine leadership costing us. Okay. Then we're going to find out what does effective leadership look like, especially going forward into the future of work. Right. And then we're going to provide solutions for every level of the workforce, whether you're at the entry level, mid level, management level, or if you're at the C suite executive level, because we can take action at any moment and at any level. And then finally, we're going to identify actions that can be implemented immediately, because I don't like doing these talks unless we're actually going to do something after this. All right. So this is what we're going to get into. So if you're ready, let's get started. So I think we first have to identify who's responsible, right? I do a lot of these, toxic masculinity at work talks, and a majority of the people that are there are typically women. When frankly, it's not their problem. Like they're the ones that have to deal with it a majority of the time, you know, but it's men that have created it. And I think there's a certain level of responsibility that men have to take on at this point because women have been working on this issue since they started in the workforce. And it's us men that have not only created the problem, but we are like potentially one of the huge players in changing the culture. And I think for many women that are potentially watching this or anyone that identifies as woman, I think we have to recognize that there are male allies out there. There are men that also don't benefit from toxic masculine leadership. But for us men, for many of the men that are watching today, we have to own and take responsibility for a certain level of this if we're willing to change it. So right now our workforce is like this, right? A lot of people hate work. I believe it was 85% of people were disengaged from work before the pandemic. So I can't imagine what's happening now. Then you had the whole quiet quitting, you have the whole great resignation. You just have people that don't like work right now. Now, we can make a perfect workplace, but we can make one where people feel slightly more appreciated, slightly more connected to one another, have some level of psychological safety so there is a team atmosphere. And that's what we're trying to get to. We're not trying to get to this idyllic, everything is perfect all the time, but we can get to a situation where we can have people that actually now want to go back to work. And right now we're not there for a majority of employees. So who am I? Who's this guy with the Lego bow tie talking about toxic masculinity? Again, my name is Jeff Harry with Rediscover Your Play. And when I was a kid, I saw the movie Big with Tom Hanks. Wasn't that a great movie? And he got to play with toys for a living. So as soon as I saw that, I was like, you can do that as a job? I want to do that as a job. So I started writing toy companies in third grade. And I did not stop until I got into the toy industry about 15 years later. And I don't know if you've ever gotten exactly what you've always wanted and then been so disappointed when you arrived. But I'm telling you, there were no toys, no fun, no high fives, no play, no kids. Like it just was so disappointing. But the most um, prevalent issue I had was it was a toxic work environment. There was a lot of bullying, there was a lot of backstabbing, there was just a lot of like toxic masculine leadership, and it just wasn't enjoyable. So I left my dream job because of a toxic workplace. And I left New York and I came to the Bay Area and I bumped into an organization that was teaching kids engineering through Lego. And it was a joke of a job paying $150 a week. But we took it because it was play and I love play. We took it from 7 people to 400 people, and it became the largest Lego inspired STEM organization in the US. And we did it all by playing. We had no idea what we were doing. We had no business plan. We followed our intuition. We picked people that we thought were fun. We picked cities that we thought were fun to expand to. We prioritized relationships over profit. We focused more on inspiring and coaching our staff rather than controlling them. And we simply followed our curiosity, and we failed all the time, but we did it with a certain level of playful energy. And it was just like, and we were super successful because of it. So it was just like, why aren't more organizations doing this if this works? So my first question to you today is like, what words describe toxic masculinity to you? What are the words that come up for you when you see this old boys club, right? What is the thing that actually comes up for you when you think of words describing toxic masculinity? One word that it isn't is it's not anti-men. And I like to address this at the beginning, right? Because a lot of men see whenever they see toxic masculinity, they're triggered and they're like, oh, this is going to be an anti-men workshop. And I'm a man. I identify as a man. I'm not against men. I'm talking about a specific type of leadership, toxic masculine leadership that can be embodied by someone that identifies as a man, a woman, identifies as trans, however you identify yourself, you still could have toxic masculine traits. I may have some that I'm still not aware of, right? And this is part of the propaganda that it's like it's made out to be it's so extreme to one side or the other, and any of us can possess toxic masculine leadership traits. And that's what we're trying to address, because those leadership traits are not beneficial for the future of work. So let's first define what toxic masculinity means. I see it as a narrow and repressive description of manhood, designated being a man as defined by dominance, aggression, individualism, and a lack of emotion. And I want to emphasize the dominance and aggression because we're going to point out moments when that happened during the pandemic soon. So a lot of the toxic masculine leadership traits include bullying, avoiding losing at all costs, you know, tamping down your emotions when conflict arises, like showing aggression, and then constantly using dominance to mask the fact that you're feeling insecure. The other reason why I put this picture up here is because it also seems sexy. It seems as if you're in control. At least that is how it's portrayed, when really a lot of times you're not in control when you're taking on certain toxic masculine leadership traits. The problem is the propaganda around how effective or supposedly effective toxic masculine leaders is rampant. You can think of Wolf of Wall Street. You can think of right now Uber, and you can think of Billions is currently out, celebrating Elizabeth Holmes, with Theranos and Dropout. I mean, heck, even the WeWork guy who just received more money for another project, even though he ran WeWork into the ground. So it's amazing that we constantly continue to invest in these toxic masculine leaders that have grandiose, narcissistic tendencies, but are not effective leaders. And I would even propose that toxic masculine leaders directly drove the Great Resignation. And here's my proof, right? Remember dominance and aggression that we talked about earlier, and bullying, right? So there were at Tesla, for example, they were forcing certain staff to go back into the factory. Same thing at some meat plants where people were dying on the job before a vaccine was even available. You know, Others, they bullied them so much and dominated so much, people walked out due to poor treatment. We even had certain people, at Facebook starting whole petitions because they were felt like they were being abused. Then in addition to that, you had publicly traded firms that were being irresponsible with their loan money. And then you even had this perfect example of American Airlines, where they laid off 17,500 frontline workers, and then 7, 8 months later, couldn't find employees, didn't know how to find employees, was just started saying, like, everyone's lazy, like people don't want to work anymore. And it's like, no, you laid off or furloughed all those employees and you just expected them to just wait around and have you come back, come back to you, and then they blamed, well, that's the reason why we have to cancel the flights. No, you had to cancel the flights because you treated your employees poorly. So, on top of all of this, most people were leaving not just because of low pay, but because they felt as if they were feeling exploited and used. And that drove the Great Resignation, this toxic masculine leadership. And then in 2021, 47.8 million people quit their jobs voluntarily. Voluntarily, meaning they did not have another job lined up, but they left anyway. That is how bad it got. And if you think that's ended, not really. In March, 4.5 million people quit their jobs, March of 2022. And then I believe it was about 4.2 million people quit in May. And there's a lot of people that are not coming back to the regular 9 to 5 workforce because of this. So all of this has happened because of toxic masculine leadership. And then on top of all of that, then you had companies that had PPP money that was supposed to go to employees, specifically to pay for their wages. And 75% of that either went back to the business owners, shareholders, creditors, or suppliers of companies receiving loans. Did not go back to the employees. So no wonder there's a Great Resignation. No wonder there's a quiet quitting movement right now. It's because companies treated their staff so poorly, and they allowed toxic masculine leaders to drive how they treated their staff. And if you need one more example, look at what happened just recently in July of 2022. Chick-fil-A, was like, well, we don't have any staff. We lost all of our staff. So you know what we're going to do? We're going to pay our customers in chicken sandwiches per hour as a way to cover this employee gap, instead of just simply paying their staff a fair wage and treating them better. So what are we doing, right? What are these companies doing? Why? How is this helpful? And I'm continuing to see companies doing this now. And if you really want to not become obsolete as an organization, you really need to start embracing a different way in which we're going to, approach work. Then let's bring it back to you. Let's talk about triggers and impact because we want to identify what are the actual triggers when you have a toxic person in your workplace and how that actually affects you so that we can start to set boundaries around this. And also, I want to just point this out to you that, I actually have a worksheet that you can actually walk through during this presentation if you like, or after the fact. And you simply can find it at rediscoveryourplay.com/RMTRA. That's RMTRA. All right. So here are some of the questions. First off, what triggers you about the toxic person at work? Is it their presence? Is it that they're getting paid more than you? Is it that they got a promotion? Is it that they take over the meetings? What are the triggers? Because the more we can identify these, the more that we can make sure these don't affect us going forward, right? And start to set boundaries around that. And then after you've answered that question, then I would ask you, how does the presence of this toxic person actually affect your work? Do you find yourself less productive, not as engaged, less of a team player? And the reason why I ask this is because, in many ways, toxic people in our workplace make us stupid. And what do you mean by that? Well, let me explain this to you. So there was a study that was done, I believe, by University of California, where they actually had two groups of students come in to take an aptitude test. And the first group comes in and they walk into a room. There's a sign that says, "Hey, the test is not in this room. It's down the hall." They go ahead, they take the test, and then that's it. The second group, when they walked into the room happened to be a professor's office. And as soon as they arrived, the professor started berating them. They were like, "What are you, stupid? What are you doing here? Clearly, this is not the place to take this test. It's down the hall. You better hurry. You're probably late. Don't ever come in my room again." And berated the students. And then they went and took the test. And they found that they performed 25% worse than the control group. The students that were berated just did really badly. Now imagine if you have this toxic person on a regular basis and the impact that is directly having on your workforce and on you. But then in addition to this, they did another test at the same time where they had someone drop their books in front of the test takers after they were coming out of the room after taking the test. And the people that were berated were 9 times less likely to help. So toxic people also make you mean. In addition to stupid, you start taking on some of that toxicity yourself and you start modeling it for other people. Oh, that's so gross. So this is the psychological impact that it potentially is having on us, and we have to be more aware so that that doesn't actually directly affect us. So then we also then have to explore, that there's an assumption about companies that believe they need an alpha male. Like if we have an alpha male, then we would do so much better as an organization. And it's just like, well, let's first talk about the myth of the alpha male, right? First off, alpha male was something that a professor actually came up with, and this professor was studying this back in the 1970s and was studying wolves in captivity and identified the term alpha male from studying these wolves in captivity. Well, anyway, and go ahead and do this, you do this research on your own as well. Well, that same professor, 20 years later, in the 90s, then studied wolves outside of captivity and found that wolf packs don't operate with an alpha male. They operate with a strong female and a strong male. That's how it works. And if there's like, an up and coming male, they will leave that pack and create their own pack. But it's typically a well-run pack is run by a strong female and a strong male. The only studies of alpha males is of animals in captivity. So if someone is like, I am an alpha male, or they claim themselves an alpha male leader, what they're really saying is they're an insecure animal in captivity. And that's how they act. So we need to first recognize that this propaganda is false and also dangerous. Now, the other assumption is that toxic masculine leadership produces higher profits. No data communicates that. And the data doesn't lie at all. If anything, companies with women in leadership positions are much more profitable than those without. Higher levels of revenue with directors, higher levels of profit with executive officers and C-suite executives. So when you diversify the leadership, you actually produce higher profits. Heck, right now, there's only 15% of CEOs that identify as a woman, but 41 of them perform extremely well out of the top 500 Fortune 500 companies. So why are we not hiring more diverse leaders? Because it brings us more profits. And if that is the goal, that's what we should be pursuing. In addition to this assumption that toxic masculine leaders produce higher profits, in fact, toxic masculine leadership costs companies billions a year, billions. Gallup did a poll, or actually a study, and this was back pre-pandemic 2019, that found that active disengagement from a toxic boss cost US companies 450 billion to 550 billion per year. People just disengaging from work. You're talking about quiet quitting. This is quiet quitting because they're affected by such poor leadership. SHRM did a similar study and found that $225 billion had been lost in the last 5 years due to people simply quitting because of a toxic staffer. So we have to recognize this is costing us real money. But what is it costing specifically your company? And let's explore that now, right? So imagine a toxic leader, a toxic masculine leader at work managing a staff of, I don't know, potentially 5, right? So, and this is the study I mentioned regarding SHRM. So what happens when you have that staff of 5? What type of effect does it have on productivity? According to a Michigan State University study, it found that you lose $14,000 per employee at the minimum, and this is assuming that average employees, I believe, getting paid about $50,000 a year. So if you have a staff of 5, that's 70K, just lost immediately. Imagine if you have multiple toxic people connected to many different leadership teams, how much money is now being hemorrhaged. In addition to that, let's think about what that toxic masculine leader, what impact they have when people quit. When someone quits, it costs 6 to 9 months of someone's salary. So if you're getting paid $60,000 a year, or that individual is getting paid $60,000 a year, we're talking about $30,000 to $45,000 lost, gone per employee. If you're at a tech company, most tech companies, people are averaging 6 figures, around 100,000. We're talking $50,000 to $75,000 per employee lost because of this person. Okay. And then in addition to that, we haven't even considered the lawsuits, the potential lawsuits, whether employee lawsuits, sexual harassment lawsuits. This is the starting amount just to do the discovery, the research to prep for the potential lawsuit. The actual lawsuit is much more than this. So we have to recognize this is real money and real liability that you're taking a risk on by keeping this toxic masculine leader, or celebrating, or promoting this toxic masculine leader. So we got to recognize this is massively impactful. And I'm giving this to you as a means to take back to your leadership and be like, how much is it actually costing our company to keep this individual? That's what the conversation that we need to be having. So then let's just talk about diversity of perspective for a moment, right? So it's not even just that you're like, oh, well, let's just get, more people of color or more women in leadership positions, and then it's all great. No, but we have to recognize why it's valuable for a diversity of perspective. So I had I have a friend who worked for a biomedical company. She was one of the only women on her team, and they were trying to figure out a new stent, to put, I believe in part of the aorta. And they couldn't figure out how to do it. And at one point she goes, well, why don't we just, use the same design as a scrunchie? And all these men in there were like, what's a scrunchie? Well, I don't know what that is. And she pulls one out of her bag and she shows them and then she passes it around. That ended up being a multi-million dollar, might have been up to $100 million patent because of diversity of perspective. So we need to recognize the value of different people in the room. So you should be asking your leadership team or in your leadership team, what does our team look like? Are we getting a diversity of perspective? Are we getting different views of the world and different histories and experiences of the world? Because that makes us a stronger team and that makes us a more profitable organization. So now let's get into what type of traits should we be looking at, like in effective leadership? What effective leadership we want going forward at our organization, right? So what traits do we want to celebrate when it comes to leadership? So this is an exercise that would have you do with your staff, where you would ask yourself, what traits do we currently have on our team, right? Are we really good at focusing on profitability? Are we really good at logic and reasoning? Do we care a lot about, being competitive and, pitting teams against one another and making sure that we're planning every next step? How are we actually, what are the traits that our team embodies, right? And you would identify those. That would be the first step that you would do in this process. Then the second step is then you would ask yourself, okay, what traits are missing from your team, right? You know, how much are we focused on cultivating a certain level of emotional intelligence? Who represents emotional intelligence? How much are we giving freedom of our staff to follow their intuition? How much are we focused on inspiring and coaching our staff rather than commanding and controlling them? So we need to explore these traits, right? What is missing right now from it? So then you would go ahead and do that part with your staff. And then after you did both of those, then you would do the big reveal to recognize that traits teams need for successful leadership are in both of these, right? There are healthy masculine leadership qualities that we definitely need, but then also there are many divine feminine leadership qualities that we also have to find and cultivate and balance. And when you bring both, that is when you're most successful. When you have a certain level of cognitive intelligence, but you're also celebrating emotional intelligence. When you're have healthy competition outside of the organization, but you're building collaboration within the organization. When you're not so much focused on just commanding and controlling, but inspiring and focusing, and coaching your staff and recognizing that it's important to focus both on the parts and individuals as it's also as important to focus on the whole. And right now we've leaned, the reason why it's toxic, this workshop's called Toxic Masculinity, is because we've leaned so far to one side. And we really need to start recognizing the other side and then recognize both sides. Because when you see a leader like Jacinda Ardern, the New Zealand prime minister, perfect example of healthy masculine and divine feminine. She was very clear and transparent and rooted, with her citizens and being like, we're locking down and this is why we're doing it. But she was also very compassionate and followed her intuition and cared about, her citizens enough to make sure that they had the resources available to not have to go into the office and make sure there wasn't a spread. And what did that lead to? That led to the lowest COVID rates in the world, lowest COVID death rates in the world. That's what happens when you find and you cultivate divine feminine leadership with healthy masculine leadership. So now let's actually determine the primary motivation and drivers of the organization. So I remember I had a toxic masculine leader at a previous organization that I worked with, and I was actually his boss. But he was friends with the CEO, and the CEO really liked him, right? So it was one of those. So I was like, okay, well, how am I going to do this? I can't just go in there. I had tried before to just go in there with emotion and be like, this guy's horrible. We got to get rid of him. And just coming from a place of like anger, not very effective. But when you actually determine the primary motivations and the drivers of that individual and the organization, you can lead from that standpoint to make your case. So when I finally came in to meet him this time, I actually just sat down with him and I was like, look, what are the main goals of our organization? The main goals of our organization is to be profitable. It's to build like a really, great organization that people feel like they want to be a part of, and build a really healthy work culture. This guy, none of the main goals are getting accomplished that way. They're just not. In addition to that, what are the values of this organization? Psychological safety, curiosity, play. This person represents none of those. If anything, they're taking away from our values, right? And it's affecting everyone else because then other people are not following those values because they see this person running amok. Then I asked, what are the main drivers of that decision maker? I knew that he wanted more market share. I knew that he wanted more profitability. And I knew that he wanted a bigger bonus at the end of the year, not just for himself, but for the whole team. And we couldn't do that because this person was taking money out of his pocket. So I was like, are you okay with that? Are you okay with us keeping this person, even though it's affecting the entire organization and directly you? And then finally, identified what are the primary motivations of that toxic staffer. Why do they act the way that they act? Do they think it's effective? You know, why do they think it is effective? And maybe if you call them out on it and you're like, what is your goal? Because it doesn't seem like you're achieving your goal right now. If you're trying to motivate people, more people are quitting because of you, right? And this is something I always talk to people about when they're like, oh, well, leaders are like, hey man, we need some new revenue generating ideas. What are some new revenue generating ideas that we could possibly explore? Could we go into AI? Could we look into something regarding VR? No, address your toxic staffer. If you address your toxic staffer, higher productivity, higher profit, higher revenue, higher retention, all of these things are beneficial when you address that toxic staff member in the room. So now let's get into specific solutions for dealing with a toxic person at work. And first, I'm going to go through, I'm going to suggest the easiest to implement, not as impactful, to hardest to implement, really impactful. And I will be using the term a-hole during this part because this is a portion of another workshop that I run. So I apologize if you're offended by the word a-hole, right? So how do you deal with this toxic person? So the first thing you can do when they're, for example, at a meeting, right, is you can reframe and redirect. So if you know this toxic person always takes up all of the meeting, you could go up to them beforehand and be like, hey, Chad. And if there's a Chad on here, I apologize. I'm just using this as an example and be like, hey, Chad, let me save you a meeting. I know we're having this meeting. Usually you point out all the problems in the meeting. Why don't I coalesce what we're talking about in the meeting and I'll bring it to you? That saves you time. Maybe you don't want to show up, or be like, hey, Chad, if you want to poke holes into all these ideas, why don't we do that at the tail end of the meeting, right? Instead of doing it throughout. So that's one way in which you can do that. Now, having said that, not the most impactful, can be done. Chad's probably going to still jump in a lot. So then the next approach that's a little bit more effective is you can then directly challenge Chad. You can directly challenge the a-hole. And what I mean by that is you can start taking up more space in the meeting. So you would work with your colleagues and be like, hey, Samantha, hey, Johnny, listen, when Chad cuts you off, I'm going to get your back. All right. So when he cuts him off and be like, whoa, we need to hear from Samantha because she's the project lead on this, thing that we're doing right now. So because of that, we need to hear from her. And then also, I think we also need to hear from Johnny because he has a lot of really good thoughts as well. And you start to do that over the span of the next 3 to 6 months, and you start to take up the meeting. So if Chad's taking up 80% of the meeting, by the end of those 6 months, hopefully now you're taking 60 to 70% with other individuals, right? And if you have a really strong facilitator, you can reduce the amount of time it takes to actually have that. In addition to that, you could approach Chad after the meeting. And let's say it's a brainstorming meeting. You'd be like, hey, Chad, so what is your goal coming, for those meetings. And he's like, well, I want to get as many ideas out as possible. Well, right now, based off of how you're acting, your behavior, it's actually having this impact. So we're not attacking people's character. We're not being like, you're a horrible person, but it's like, but when you act in this way, this is the impact that it's having. Is this what you want? So you objectively ask that. And they might be like, oh, I didn't even realize that that was something that happened. That might be it. Probably not going to happen. But then you never know. That's why you got to be open to it. Maybe they don't know they're an a-hole, right? But then they might just be like, whatever, I don't really care. I'm going to do whatever I want. And then at that point, that is when you actually start to approach your boss and start to approach HR and be like, this is the impact that it's having, especially on our meetings, and we're not being productive this way. It's detrimental to the organization. Now, let's say you approach your boss and you say this, or you've said this numerous times, and you're now recognizing that your boss is also an a-hole. So then you realize this is a great opportunity, because you realize at this point, where does the company stand? And when you skip over your boss's boss, you do a skip level and talk to them, or you talk to HR, or you talk to both. You get an opportunity to see where this organization actually stands when it comes to supporting toxic masculine leaders. Do they support them? Do they protect them at all costs? And that's what you're going to ask when you're approaching them with your issues that you have, right? And then if they choose to support them, great. That means this is not the right organization for you, and it's time for you to look for somewhere else, right? Or they may start making progress. The progress might be slow, and then you have to decide, do I want to stick around for 2 to 5 more years in order to address this person? We had another toxic masculine leader that took him 5 years before he started going to therapy. If you're investing in the organization, then maybe that's not a lot of time. For other people, that seems like so long. So you have to decide for yourself, is it worth me staying? Now, having said that, the hardest to implement is addressing the inner Chad, the inner a-hole in you. Why does that toxic person actually affect you, right? Is it because you believe what they have to say? Is it because, you think that they should get paid more than you? Is it because you think they should get a promotion or that they should be your boss? You have to identify why these things actually affect you. And the more you can realize, like, wait a minute, I shouldn't be getting paid more than Chad. I should actually have a promotion. I should be speaking more than Chad. I should be actually his boss. And the more you set those boundaries, the next time Chad is really rude to you, you can be like, whoa, Chad, don't ever speak to me that way. And if you say that at a meeting, then all of a sudden Samantha and Johnny are like, whoa, Jeff just stood up to Chad. Daphne just stood up to Chad. So if they can, I will as well. And then when everyone is standing up to this individual and they can't act out anymore, then they have a choice. They either change their behavior or they leave, because toxic masculine leadership thrives in silence. I'll say it again. Toxic masculine leadership thrives in silence. So the more we can check it, right, and check them, the more that all that insecurity shows up, and it falls like a house of cards. So we have to realize that we need to be setting these boundaries and that we cannot be silent. Now, having said that, let's talk about various levels of positions of power, because a lot of times you're like, I'm at the entry level, so I have no power. I'm a mid-level manager, like I can't do much, right? And I'm saying there's still a certain level of agency. Yes, there are certain power dynamics, and we cannot ignore those power dynamics, but I want you to recognize what agency you do have at your level, regardless of your level, right? So let's first get into entry level and junior level staff. You're at the ground floor, so you get to see everything. That is really important. So one of my first suggestions is to find allies and employees that have similar issues. Share your story of what experience you've had with your Chad, right? With your toxic masculine leader, and start to document that. Document some of what other employees are saying. There once was a story of some individuals that had toxic journals, and multiple people on the team had toxic journals and documented what this toxic masculine leader was doing. And over the span of 3 months, they had so many journals that when they handed to HR couldn't ignore it, and they had to let that person go. So you actually can have an effect even at the entry level, and also recognize that you have a certain level of leverage because they don't want you to leave. It's still really hard to find good staff. So because of this great resignation that slowly is continuing, you have more leverage, and recognize you have power. Second, identifying what mid-level managers can do. Now, I know you're getting crapped on from the top and you're getting complaints from the bottom, but you still have a certain level of power. And first, what we have to identify why people were quitting in the first place. Asking your staff, right? So first, explore why your staff are quitting. Look at the exit interviews. Reach out to former employees. What were the reasons? Find out if they had toxic journals as well. And then ask your employees how they were treated these last 2 years. Did we gain your trust, or did we lose your trust during the pandemic? Can you even have that hard conversation with your staff? And if not, then I would first recommend identifying their languages of appreciation, start building rapport with them, and then eventually have that conversation of like, did we gain trust or lose trust during the pandemic? And then recognize that you have a circle of influence, that you still have power within your team. You might not have power in the whole organization, but if you can show results with your team and you're showing that you have higher retention and higher profitability, it's because you're not leading from a toxic masculine leadership place. All of a sudden everyone else is like, well, what are you doing? Because I want to do that too, because I want to make more money, or I want to not have to deal with all these issues that I'm currently dealing with everyone quitting. Right. So this is what you have. This is the power that you have at the mid-level management position, right? Build rapport with your team and start showing a new way in which you can lead. And then finally, at the C-suite and executive level, this is the question that I'm constantly telling executives to ask themselves, what is the worst behavior you are currently tolerating? And in addition to that, right? So what is the worst behavior you're currently tolerating? And then another question you can ask on the flip side, well, what is the best behavior that you're recognizing? Are you even recognizing the best behavior right now? Or are you simply just tolerating the worst behavior? And if so, why are you tolerating that behavior? Because that is setting a tone. That is setting the culture. You may not think that, but just because they're running amok, everyone else is like, can I do that? Can I act that way? Because Chad's acting that way. Then we really have to reassess, what metrics are we using to measure our success by? Are we still focused just on quarterly profits, right? Or are we focused on sustainability and retention and longevity because we're hemorrhaging money, whenever someone quits? Because you can't be profitable if you're losing staff all the time. So we really have to reassess, what are the more important metrics that we need to be looking at? And then finally, for a lot of larger organizations, you need to be funding your employee resource groups. And for organizations that are like, what is an employee resource group, also known as an ERG? They are groups that actually come together to tackle a specific issue. Like, we don't have enough women leaders, or we need to work on certain DEI initiatives. An employee resource group can actually form and be created, and then with people from many different departments come together to actually tackle this issue. Why are these employee resource groups so important? Because these sometimes are the only places where staff feel seen, heard, appreciated, and valued. And if they're not receiving it from their main team, this might be the only team right now that they're getting that level of recognition and this recognition of feeling seen and understood. And that might be the only reason why they're staying. So fund those employee resource groups. Have them actually take on those initiatives to tackle a lot of these issues that create a much more psychologically safe culture. And then as we finally end or get to the strategy and implementation part, now we really have to ask the hard questions, right? What is the question of like, what are your goals in addressing this toxicity at work? Are you simply trying to get Chad fired? Because if you simply get this one person fired, that might not address all of the issues that you're having with your organization. Just because you removed one individual, they still might be celebrating toxic masculine leaders. So you got to be clear about what your goals are, right? So identify what are your main goals that you want to accomplish, and then identify what are the initial steps you can do to begin. Small steps. Who am I going to speak to first? Who am I going to look for, that are going to be my allies? What am I going to do regarding documentation? Identify one or two small steps you can do, and then identify the allies that can help implement your strategy, because you can't do it alone. And again, toxic masculinity thrives in silence. So if you are simply doing it by yourself, you're supporting toxic masculine leadership. So start having conversations with other individuals and building allies and building that community. And then finally, you have to recognize there's going to be a lot of obstacles that are going to get in your way. And that might be leadership. That might be, parts of HR. That might be that toxic masculine leader themselves. So because of that, right, recognizing those obstacles are going to show up, and then you're going to take 3 steps forward and you're going to take 2 steps back, and it's going to take some time. And that's where you identify, am I willing to invest all this time in order to change the organization? Is it worth it? Is it worth it over the next 2 years for me to help implement this strategy with my colleagues in order to address this? Or am I just ready to leave? Right. And that's for you and only you to answer. So, what we really have to understand now is where we're going. What type of future of work are we choosing to head towards? There are a lot of toxic masculine leaders right now that are really pushing for us to go to pre-pandemic times, where we're celebrating individualism and competition and control and ego, and celebrating the new Rockefellers like Steve Jobs and Elon Musk and, Mark Zuckerberg, right? Not healthy. Not healthy, but there is that. And that propaganda is strong. But then there's a whole other group, and led by organizations that have been doing a lot of things like Zappos with Tony Hsieh when he was alive, many organizations that care about shared humanity. They care about collaboration, intuition, inspiration, compassion, empathy, a lot of emotional intelligence. That is what employees, especially Gen Z, expects from staff now, expects from their leadership. They expect a certain level of emotional intelligence. And if you're choosing to cultivate that over pre-pandemic leaders, you're going to have a more helpful, connected, compassionate, strong community that you can build a whole organization around. And a play mentor of mine, Kevin Carroll, would always say, you'll find the future where people are having the most fun. And if you look at the organizations or the companies that thrived during the pandemic, they are the ones that were playing the most, right? They were the ones that were experimenting the most. But you can only do that when you have a psychologically safe workspace. You can only play and give your staff the freedom to follow their intuition when you have that healthy place. And as long as we're celebrating toxic masculine leaders, we cannot play in the workplace. We cannot have a fun work environment. And that is not a work environment that a lot of Gen Z, and heck, every level, millennials, boomers, Gen X, Zennials want to go into. They want to like their work, but right now they don't, because we're celebrating way too much toxic masculine leadership. So as we're recapping what we covered today, we have to learn from the mistakes of the past. Let's stop celebrating the Wolf of Wall Street and all these toxic leaders. We have to outline to our leadership how much it's costing us. So recognize, run the numbers for yourself and show it to your boss and be like, do we want to continue down this route? And then we have to celebrate healthy masculine and feminine leadership. We have to identify what is the behavior we want to have, what are leadership traits we want to celebrate, and be recognizing those individuals by promoting them, by celebrating them, by recognizing them, you know. And then we have to pick a solution that works specifically for our team. So even if you can't control the whole organization, you have agency within your team. So focus on the solutions that are within your circle of control, within your circle of influence. And then finally, it's time. It is finally time to take some action. And remember, when you do this, that you're going to make mistakes and you're going to make them over and over again. And the more that you have hard conversations, whether that's with your chat or whether that's with other individuals, the more practice you get, the easier each time it will be. Because again, toxic masculine leadership thrives in silence. So the more action we take, the more we begin to dismantle the toxic masculinity at our workplace. And that is my presentation. Feel free to scan this QR code that also takes you to rediscoveryourplay.com/RMTRA. And feel free to reach out to me, tag me, on my social media if you start to implement some of these actions, as I always love to hear stories, that come from the workplace of like, we implemented this, and over the next 2 to 3 months, this is the actual impact that it had. Now, having said that, as I wrap up, I want to recognize this is not going to be easy, and this is going to be hard, and it's going to be messy, and you're going to make some mistakes, and you're going to wonder if you're all alone much of the time. But the more that you actually reach out and the more you actually share your story with other people, right, the more you'll realize you're not alone. And the more you'll realize that other people don't like this way of leading either. And you'll start to gain a certain level of hope. And when you do that and you start to take action, not only are you creating such a great psychologically safe work environment for you and your team, right? But you're creating one for all these other people that are going to follow after you, right? So any work that you do is having an impact. You are making progress. So recognize, give yourself credit, give yourself a certain level of self-compassion when things aren't working out as well, and recognize that anything that you do to address that silence and challenge that toxic masculinity directly will have an impact going forward. Thank you so much. My name is Jeff Harry with Rediscover Your Play, and I hope you appreciated my presentation. Take care.